Alright, gents, we're continuing to go through my inventory of lures. Obviously, I emptied out my boat from the previous season and going through some of my stock, basically deciding some of the stuff that I want to put maybe in a garage sale, get rid of. Because I obviously don't use them all. And there's some that are so nice, some of my customs, that I don't want to use for the simple fact that they are one of a kind and built specifically for a collector and not so much for fishing. And one of those examples, for any of you guys being June of 2022, might recognize this image. This is the Dark Star Jet from the just recently reduced or just recently released Maverick Top Gun 2 movie. And I made this before the movie came out. This was something that before the pandemic hit, when the previews for the movie started coming out, that was the one view that you were able to see in the movie as it was doing a ground pass. Um, with some of my background within the military and stuff like that, so basically I just took the top and copied the F-117, I believe it is, the stealth fighter. So I just went off of the average Generation 6 fighter jet or stealth fighter jet and combined it into one. And now that the movie came out, the only thing that's a little bit different is instead of it having a flat back from the cockpit area through the engines, this area is not so flat. It is more of a tapered teardrop. So pretty good for just going off of that one angle like this here, you know. But that's one of the things I'm known for. That kind of got my name on the map as far as with collectors, is that guys that are into military aircraft, or Navy sea craft, tanks, stuff like that. That's what I really got into, and seems to have the highest drawing. Eastern Wisconsin has been a good location for the military type vehicles. The Winnebago Musky Club auctioned off a few of my lures a couple years ago, and they raised a ton of money for charity off of four examples that I did with a Huey Cobra helicopter, AH-22, what was the other ones? A-10 Warthog, flap tail. So again, all those lures were built to actually work as a fishing lure. So they do go through water tests and flow tests, but they're meant to be more of that, shelf stand collectors. Obviously, they all get a specific label to them, the year that they are finished, and multiple layers of clear coat. So that's just one of the examples. In the last video, I said the next video I was going to do was on crankbaits. I'm going to do a separate video on that. Just going through my box, I want to get everything taken out of my box before I finish taking some stuff off of the hangers. Well, the other things, multiple on my box here, was another variation of a rear prop style. Um, I just wanted to show you guys this variation because it's built a little bit different than the other ones, and is that the blade is not mounted inside the rear section of the body, and the hook hangers don't necessarily are not attached to the bottom of the lure. You guys see here, the leaders actually go through the eyeballs. All right, pretty easy to see. With that location of that leader going through the more of the center of the lure, it gets a wider footprint and more stabilization on top of the water. With the hooks hanging out to the edge and the leader going through that portion of the front section, this lure is very stable. Even though it's completely round, it doesn't have any flat surfaces for stabilization. This lure is very stable within the water. As you can see right now, I'm just holding on to the fins. It's a very stable lure. A difference in this lure also is it uses the twin prop design. Instead of a blade being put into the wood here, they are both attached onto the back through each other so that each one has a specific purpose. The black with the holes drilled in them, those are actually bubble producers. So as that blade goes through the water and the water fights to get through that hole, it creates a bubble. Whereas in the chrome plated stainless, they are cupped just like a whopper plopper, and they have different orientation. They have different rakes to them. You notice that some are pitched up just a little bit more. So the chrome ones are pitched forward a little bit more with a curl to them. The black ones have no curl, but they're just pitched. Okay, that takes a lot of time and testing and tuning before any paint can be done. It's going to the water, you have to sit there and bend each one to be specific, try it out, get exactly what you want, and then go back and paint and clear coat and everything like that. So it's a timely process, especially when you're doing one-offs like this, to get the exact action that you want out of them. Again, this has the balancing tube inside of the rear section, and the blades are offset identical to each other, so the balance is very good. With the centering shaft in there, there's no friction between the leader that goes through it and the wooden body. It is brass against the leader, so there's no lubrication, any kind of oils or anything on there like that. You can imagine there's not a whole lot of resistance there. So when this lure is going through the water, it can go very slow, and it'll create a lot of bubbles, and it'll get a plop for every 180 degrees that this turns around. When this stainless steel one is hitting that resistance of the plop, hitting the water, there's at least two blades that are driving that system to the next point. Okay, so you can imagine if that's a plop right here, the two blades are at the bottom or help drive that plop, your hand into the water. Okay, for anybody swimming, splashing, you get that plop into the water. So without retrieving this very fast, it creates a lot of havoc, a lot of noise, right? Mimicking black and white. I guess that's another thing that I didn't cover in a previous video too, with the rear prop systems. Anytime you have a moving part that's moving around, I talked about the silhouette and how small it gets with light refraction and the speed of the lure going through the water, the wake of the water going over it. The more wake there is and the more light refraction, the smaller the lure appears, so the larger you have to actually make the lure to give it that bigger profile. Another thing you can do to aggravate or to get a reaction strike from a fish is to alter colors. So as this is spinning around, there is a white belly and then the black top. So as it's going around, you can see the light refraction even here, just off of my ceiling light here. The light refraction there is enough to pulsate and strobe flashes of light to you. Now you can imagine if that's a fish, if it's looking at something just stagnant, just sitting there, just going across the surface of water, splashing a little bit, it's not invoking any of their small little brains to activate. So having that additional color refracting off of the whatever the color of the lure is and the sunlight itself will also aid in getting more attention to the lure. And as slow as this goes to spin those props the way that is, you can cover a lot of ground with each individual cast with this style of lure. This one does get a lot of rear tie style attacks to it. All right, so keeping the hooks away from the moving components, low enough that's away from the lure, but not so far that it's actually hanging this, down here, that when a fish comes up, it's actually going to get tracked farther back into the throat. They are away from the lure, but they're tucked up underneath, so they're still close to the main body. So if a fish comes in here, you're getting a multiple hook set. Using smaller hooks, using multiple hooks of a smaller gauge increases the amount of hooks that get into the fish, but they also have shorter shanks so that if it's going in, it's not necessarily going through and causing any kind of damage on the inside of the fish. I've only had one instance where I've lost one of the larger fish that I've caught, and it was one of those cases where even if I had my cutter and was able to trim the hook off, it actually was big enough that it went through the inside of the eye. It does happen, that possibility is out there, but anything you can do when you're a bait builder to incorporate those designs into it by using different size hooks, different shaped hooks, and the hook placement within a lure is greatly appreciated to the fish and all the other anglers that will ever catch that fish again in the future. Alright, let's see here. Just going through my box one at a time. You guys already seen the rear flap. The large rise and dives. That'll be a video all by itself. This just happens to be on the top. These are some of the first lures I ever made. The Remington. You guys seen that? First video. Alright, let's get into some other ones here. All kinds of surface lures. Alright, this is about the only one. This is the one of the rare circumstances of this where this is actually a trolling lure. Okay, you guys can see that. I needed a lure for Lake Superior, basically. I wanted something that could be trolled very slowly and be able to control the depth. So even though this lure is only 5 inches long of the body, this weighs over 6 ounces. And because of the adjustable tail fin, it also causes it to run more in this action. It's got the long pointy snout like a glide bait, but then it's also hooked up to a fancier leader. This is a single strand titanium leader with swivels. So as this is going through the water, the flash of that fin is mimicking a small minnow with a larger prey fish going after it. And you can control the depth of where this lure is working. And because of that rake of that fin and the heavy design of this lure, it'll run and you can control the depth without having a crankbait. Most of you guys that are familiar with Rapalas, they'll have online graphs that you can go by. So if you have a certain lure, it'll tell you the speed and the distance of line that's out behind the boat, and they'll give you a general direction of what depth that lure is running. This lure is designed as not necessarily downrigger, but off the end of the pole to be able to run at the depth that you choose. No matter how far behind the boat, this one is going to, because of the angle of the leader and the line coming from it, and the weight and the position of this tab, you can predetermine what depth you want to run, no matter how far behind the boat this is. It took some thinking to actually do this, and I have yet, as you guys can see, the hook protectors on here so far, I have yet to try this out. Okay, it's one of the very few lures that I put up for sale before I actually used it. It does obviously have a float test into it, but I have not used this on any of the Great Lakes yet. But this was specifically made for the Bay of Green Bay for in the spring during the spawn. So now that this did not sell, it'll give me a chance to get out there and actually give it a shot to see if it works. Obviously we're past the spawn this year, So it'll have to be something to wait until next year. All right, I got all kinds of bucktails, custom bucktails that I did. Again, if you guys are getting into bucktails, there's all kinds of different variations out there. Okay, there's more variations of a bucktail than there is of all other lures combined. You have to figure out what you like, what works for you, your ability to actually tie them off, how they work, the materials needed to build them. There's plenty of places on YouTube that show how to make them, and not necessarily why you would make them the way they are. So you can see on most of these we have the large willow blades, different colors. The skirting material is also very different. Again, it's all, most of these purple ones are designed again for Green Bay. It seems to be like the hot color for the last 5 or 6 years. Purple and whites have been a very hot color up in the Green Bay area. So they're constructed just a little bit different to run a little different speeds and at different depths and at different angles. Okay, this one's a little bit tail heavy, so it's going to be running more like this. This one's not as tail heavy, so it's going to be more of a horizontal, thus the larger skirting material. All that kind of different thought goes into bucktail, so that alone would be like a 2 or 3 hour video. All right, here's another flap tail. Just a little bit different variation of it. Again, using the shotgun shell. This time I only used the brass portion, not the plastic. And it does have, I'm going to hold this tight so you guys can tell it's not the blade. There is a ball bearing inside of there, so the ball bearing making contact with that. Because of the shorter, stubbier design, when this is going through the water, it does not have a straight retrieve. It likes to shake quite a bit like this and head dive. And that causes the blade to go back and forth and make contact with the brass. Let's see if I can do this so you guys can hear it. Okay, you can distinctively hear the difference, brass on brass, compared to here's one's brass blades, but this is actually a it's not a brass casing. It's a different material. I can't think of it, but you can just hear that more of a deadening sound compared to the brass. Okay, and then with that bead inside, it's like a baby rattle. Okay, now this one here, I went with the darker top again for really sunny days, but blaze orange belly, mimicking some sort of a bird. And I actually used bird feathers on the sides. So the bird feathers are actually epoxied into it with a little bit sticking out. Again, just a little bit finer touches there to make whatever color you want. The eyes on this one are not the three-dimensional prism eyes. These are crystal eyes. So your regular bling that you might find at a craft store to glue on to, say, like if you're into like scrapbooking or decorating a outfit or something like that. These are the kind of diamonds you can find. Just glue it on, and then when you epoxy over the top of them, they round the eyes off, and you can put a dot a dot pupil on there. They won't move, but they're there. Just gives you that 3D effect. Another single, very short rear flap tail. This is something very small. It's going to be more for like bass. This is only just over 3 inches long. A small, I think this is a 22 Hornet casing with a tail on it. There is no swivel on this tail, as you guys notice. It is meant to work off of the water going underneath it and causing it to kick up. It has a stabilizing flat bill area to it and one single hook that is shrink wrapped into position. So no matter which way the strike comes from here, you're counting on that one treble hook to do the work. Like I said, it's more for bass. Let's see here. Here's a double hook design and a triple prop design. So it has the rear flap tails. Again, 2 of them. So as this is going behind it, they're hitting each other and they're also hitting the rifle casing, creating a lot of noise. And also, because the front of this lure is so blunt, I added a little spinner to it. So as it is going through the water, it's helping deviate the water up and around the lure and get turmoil. So when it's going over these blades, it causes them to kick around anymore. If the water flow over the lure was nice and smooth, these blades would basically just drag behind the lure and they won't have a whole lot of action. So causing a disturbance at the front of the lure is just like the aerodynamics of a car. As the air transfers over the car when it comes off the back of the vehicle, there's all kinds of turbulence unless you have some kind of a rear fin or foil or something like that that brings the air back in. Or like somebody would understand, like the aerodynamics of a golf ball going through the air. The golf ball dimples allow the air to travel around the exterior of the golf ball and collect more uniformly behind the golf ball. This is doing just the opposite effect. It's that blunt action here. It carries that terminal back here and it turns it into all kinds of different directional flow where the blades are, kicking them all over. So again, creates a lot of noise. Twin hook design. It's another variation. That one's made out of wood. Here's another double bladed design, very similar to that, just a different paint scheme. Again, this one is a 30-06 casing on here, so it's a little bit longer. You can hear that noise. Oh, let's see here. All right, for you guys that are Green Bay Packer fans, this is one I designed kind of using the colors of the Green Bay Packers. Again, that darker color on the top, white belly, orange sides with a number 8 Colorado blade, 12 gauge shotgun, no rattles in it, so it's just 100% the contact between the blade and that shotgun shell. Again, you notice the gills, it's not a perfectly cylindrical shape. It does have the gills within a profile. Again, that's going off of that flow of the water over the lure. Those gills help kick out the water and create sidewards vortices, causing this blade to have more action and cause it to run into that blade or into that casing more often and harder. Just another variation of that. Again, the gills stick out. This one uses a little bit different blade onto it, an actual flap tail blade. Smaller casing again. So this is the different sound between the stainless and brass. So you notice the difference, even with one piece of these two being brass, it has a very distinctive sound that carries much farther in the water than other materials or really thin, cheap tin is what you would find in most box store designs. Again, just another different variation of a frog. This one, you notice it's got a much wider and flat chin area. So this one rides in the water, canted just a little bit, so it gets more of a tail wag to it. Like a toad that's on the top of the water. Here's another one of the short casings. This one is actually a stop and go flap tail. Now when I say stop and go flap tail, it means the lure is actually meant to come to a stop. And then you notice the shape of the mouth is just like in popper style lure. So you pop it, wait a few seconds, and then start retrieving, getting the blade spinning. Okay. Stopping, doing a plop again, going with the action. So this one is going to be a very slow action, lazy type reaction strike off of the lure. Again, all the lures are on clevises, so you can change whatever blade you want. They're on swivel, so there's going to be no tangles there. This one has rattles in it. So again, on that plop, the rattles are actually traveling forward inside of that chamber, and it also has the noise. So the ploppy noise and the rattle inside of that, plus the action of a flap tail. So it's kind of a hybrid, I guess if you want to call it. Now this is the last of the flap tails in my box here. Again, another very large blade. The larger the blade, the more tail action the lure will have, because the weight of the blade actually pulls the lure around. And as it's doing that, it does occasionally make contact with the casing. So brass blade and aluminum, it's a little bit more deadened. With the shorter profile, fat short profile, again it has a lot of head shake when it's going through the water because of this blade going back and forth. So again, it doesn't need rattles inside of it, even though it does. As those are going around, it's just another added aspect of creating sound and vibration to emanate as much as possible throughout the water, and then the larger body profile to give it that more visual profile to be picked up by fish from longer distances away. This one could be fished obviously a little bit faster than the popper style. Again, just to crystallize. Alright, so that's it for those. I got two more lures here for you guys. Both of them are flat-sided rise and dives. Now, I have to specifically say flat-sided rise and dives because there are rise and dives that are horizontally. There's rise and dives that are cylinders. There's a combination of the two. There's rise and dives that are half solid, half soft tails. These are just some of the variations of the flat-sided rise and dives that I have. Okay, with this one here, as the Suic tail hardware on it, the line tie again is in the head. So this is something that's going to have a really high rise, and it's going to have a gentle rollover before it then follows your line tie or your line, your fishing line, down to another point, and then you're going to have to jerk it up. And when you jerk it up again, because of the tail angle at this, it's straight up and down, so it's really going to cause this lure to pop back up. It's going to be a really strong rise and a low sink, slow sink. The color combination on this is a white tiger. It does have the scale effects into it. Let me see if I can get a reflection for you guys to see. You can see it is not perfectly gloss, smooth, even though there is 3 layers of clear on here. The second layer has that webbing, the netting inside of it, so as you feel this, you can still feel the scale type texture as a real fish. All right. And again, the color shift paints with the orange belly, just something that's going to stand out. Anytime you have a rise and dive with this design, making sure that you have something at the leading edge, the nose of the lure, will allow the lure to last longer because it'll make contact with the structure. So this one here, when I let the final epoxy dry, I actually mounted up this so I had my drip of my epoxy, the runoff, come to the nose, so there's an additional material there for that to just basically smash into rocks or any kind of structure, and it's not going to do a whole lot of damage to the lure. That's one advantage of having lures that are epoxied with very thick coatings. If you're using suics that are just a oil-based paint on the top of them, you'll notice immediately, after your first use, the paint on the nose will be flaking off and it'll expose the wood that's underneath. With custom lures, with the addition of metal lips or thicker epoxy at the nose or a line tie at that area, it's not going to take as much abuse. Or it will take more abuse. It won't get damaged as much. Alright, back to my first lures here. So I get the last one in the box and then the first one I started the video out. These are my first rise and dives that I ever made. And each one has a specific design into it that is different than what most lure builders use. And as I describe this one, this is my first one. This is my third one. Okay. The differences in these is that if you notice the front profile, they're very wide at the back, but the bellies are very thin. That allows the weight to be mounted a little bit higher up into the cavity of the lure. So when it's coming to a stop, or if it starts to turn, it wants to roll over. It wants the weight wants to carry over. And that's where you start to get the roll in a rise and dive. Okay, so it's not a jerkbait. Even though the belly drops down right here, most of the weight is actually right behind my finger right here. So it does rise and dive because of the shape of the lure. But once the lure is coming down and starting to slow down, it wants to roll over on its side and actually turn sideways. And then when you pull it back up, it goes back up, and it does the same thing to the other side. It kind of rolls to the side. Instead of using the typical hardware rear tail fin, I actually created my own rigid plastic tail off of other molds that I showed you guys, that I also use for the polysaw. It's the exact same mold. I just put it in a hard plastic, mount it in there. What's nice about the plastic that I use is if you want to curve it, all you have to do is heat it, hold it to the position you want, let it cool, and then it stays into that position. So it goes through the process again of water testing it before you paint it to get the right shape of the tail to match the action that you want. And then once you epoxy it all in, you can epoxy even the tail in, and then it will last for a very long time. This was done in multiple different layers of using foils. There's actually gold and silver leaf foils built on top of a scale pattern and a base foil on this lure. So it's 5 layers of epoxy and a different colored foil used at each layer. Same with the fins. Instead of the fins being painted on, I actually dye the epoxy so it becomes somewhat transparent like a real fish fin, and it also gives a 3-dimensional fin that's there. So the color is actually inside the epoxy when I'm doing it. So even though this head is all carved out, you can see the profile of the gills just like a real fish. These are painted on eyes, with the gold as being the base color, and then the second to last coat with the black pupil, so there is depth to the eye. Being my first lures, these came a little heavier than I wanted them to be. These come in at about 7 ounces a piece. So again, for your average novice, they're a little bit heavier than what you can throw. But for guys that are used to throwing pounders all day, and then they go and pick this up, it's nothing. Non-adjustable, it's all built into the lure, rise and dive. The other one, my very first one, this one I did use the metal hardware tail. Same thing with layering of the epoxy, and you guys can see this one has got the scale effect in it. This has got that wire mesh inside of it. So you can feel the scales into it. This has got, again, 5 coats of clear onto it. The one thing that I did different with this one compared to all the lures that I did afterwards, real quick too, even the cheeks, like I said, is the foil. That's not paint. That's actually done with the aluminum foil tape. Okay, so you can really get that stuff to hug into the detail of the mouth and eyes and gills, right? The one thing I did differently with this lure than with any other lure is that I embedded the hooks. And you guys notice that there's, I'm going to hold on to these hooks. There's also rattles in this one. This one is, being my first one, it was made out of plastic. I made a master mold for all of these larger lures like this. And I was experimenting with plastics, the expanding foams. This happens to be the solid plastic one. High impact plastic with the coatings and foils over the top. Painted with a color shift paint. The netting for the scale pattern. And then because it was plastic, I did not trust at the time. This was made in let's see here, 2014. And instead of using eye screws that were put into after the paint job was done, or put in to the point where they're hanging out, I actually sunk them in to the bottom of the lure. So instead of having to use split rings, these were eye hooks that I closed around the treble hooks and mounted them in there. So I had to paint and epoxy around that and tape it off. And that's why I have not made that design ever since. Okay. They do work as far as keeping the hooks from making contact with the lure. That's the original design, or the original reason why I did that. Because anytime the hook makes contact with the epoxy, it grinds it away, or with the paint, it wears it off. So I wanted something that would restrict the hooks from actually making contact with the lure. And that's what I did. But needless to say, it is very difficult to then paint and epoxy your lures when you do it that way. So I think that's probably why I have not made another lure like that since then. So with that is all I got for you guys today. Like I said, within the next couple of days here, we'll be getting into crankbaits. And I want to specifically go over the difference of box store crankbaits compared to custom variations of that exact same lure. The things that you can do to modify your lures or to make your own to increase your ability and hook set percentage wise. Notice the difference placement of the hooks. Same shape, same size, just with added fins onto it. Again, these were some of the first batch of plastic lures I made. These were made out of the Smooth On product that they intend for actually fishing lures. It's a self-buoyant hard plastic. That's what these are made out of. So that'll be in an upcoming video. Alright, real quick, I also want to bring attention, eventually another future video will be on different polysaw lures. Advantages to them, disadvantages to them, where to use them. Okay, no matter what they are, the smaller, special hollow body tubes or the whale tails are very good lures for novice that don't have that very heavy equipment, and they will still produce quite a bit. And even after the lure and the hooks maybe go to crap on this, you can still save this tail for adding it to other lures down the road, such as a glide bait. So with that, I'm going to let you guys go. Have a good one.